When it comes to horror, we usually deal with big things. Not necessarily on a physical scale, but when put into perspective with us as individuals. Monsters that are an extraordinary character in our ordinary world. Dark powers beyond our comprehension of what is possible and what is not. And even with an absence of a supernatural, an imminent threat seemingly outmatching us entails death on the regular. But how big these things actually are, we only start to realize when taking a closer look. Stephen King said it best in his non-fiction book, Danse, Macabre. The good horror tale would dance its way to the center of your life and find the secret door to the room you believed no but you knew of. Because books and movies are mass media, the field of horror has often been able to do better than even these personal fears. During that period, the horror genre has often been able to find national-phobic pressure points. And those books and films which have been the most successful almost always seem to play upon and express fears which exist across a wide spectrum of people. Such fears, which are often political, economic and psychological rather than supernatural, give the best work of horror a pleasing allegorical feel. And it's the one sort of allegory that most filmmakers seem at home with. Maybe because they know that if the shit starts getting too thick, they can always bring the monster shambling out of the darkness again. So we are dealing with big things, not because the horror we are confronted with is beyond us, overpowering us or something like that, but because it encompasses something we beyond an individual scale and instead in total fear. The monster at hand just gives shape to the terror behind it. It's an allegory. We don't so much fear Count Orlok from Nosferatu as we fear the epidemic that comes with him. He is nothing but pestilence. We don't so much fear Jason Voorhees as we fear our very neighbor potentially being him without us knowing. He is nothing but urbanization. The list goes on and on, you get the idea I'm sure. And that's what I mean when I say we deal with big things. We deal with common fears on a broad scale that 10,000s, much more actually, can relate to, consciously or not. It's what makes horror fun and worth exploring, since with changing times, common fears change as well. And now, we're here. A new subgenre of horror that still needs to cement itself has emerged, dealing with very small things on paper, compared to the grandness we are used to. A genre that is surprisingly personal and yet very tangible for a lot of us, almost contradicting what Stephen King acutely put into words beforehand. I'm talking about the horror of the mundane. As you know, that's the video title.
Where's my salad?
If you haven't noticed already, life's pretty scary. And living in an over-digitalized world that watches your every move, proceeds to judge it, and then determines whether you'd be a valuable asset to this brand new startup with flat hierarchies that produces artisan taco shells or something like that, doesn't make it easier. Quite the opposite, actually. People are anxious as hell, and even something so trite as a phone call becomes an immovable task that feels like a life and death situation. And on top of that come personal fears and problems, money, mental health, a pandemic, and so many more factors that turn everyday life, the ordinary, into something that a lot of us deem frightening. A general fear that stems from personal experiences, and thus is very private, while also being commonly understood. The horror of the mundane connects with this right away. As Byron Bixler said in his article for the filmicmag, in this mode of horror, the setting, characters, and situations of a story are mostly ordinary and lack any stylistically imbued suspense. The plot may appear nonchalant in its progression, and there's generally more emphasis placed on interpersonal relationships and everyday problems. A horror premise typically frames the film, but rarely enters the story in a major way. In other words, we are dealing with small things for the most part. A bigger evil can appear, I would argue, but as Bixler said so befittingly, it doesn't really enter the story. It's negligible and not the big bad our protagonists have to overcome that we are so used to. The allegories we are confronted with are much more subtle. Not a vampiric aristocrat, but a telephone. Actually, let's dig a little deeper here. When working with allegories, we ascribe meaning to a subject that is able to carry that meaning sufficiently. And in the case of a horror of a mundane, we quite obviously ascribe all of it to everyday subjects, to the mundane. That follows, right? And that can be about anything if it meets set criteria. An ordinary thing that successfully encapsulates personal fears and or traumas. An interesting concept to say the least, and if that sounds familiar to you, that probably is because it is very similar to, but not necessarily a trigger. A trigger, to be more precise, refers to something that causes people with a post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, to uncontrollably recall or even relive traumatic experiences. They are very personal and not the same for any two people. Sights, smells, tastes, all of these can be potential triggers. And I'm gonna say that right now, trigger warnings are very important accordingly because it makes life for people with PTSD a lot easier. Reliving your traumas is deeply unpleasant and you don't want to cause that for anyone you know. Just be a little considerate with people, you don't know what they've been through, it's not that hard. I digress. Anyways, trigger warnings of course are a product of us being more willing to talk about mental health publicly. and us being more educated on the topic overall. In fact, I do think that the horror of the mundane as a genre could only emerge more actively due to us as a society having a better understanding of mental health related issues, and being more willing to see each other's struggles. This newly found empathy in turn enables us to regard a personal problem as something much more general, that more of us are familiar with, than we initially would like to believe. Suffice it to say, the horror of the mundane is very closely linked to mental health.
Where's my salad?
Here you are, dear, just the way you like
Making Me a Sandwich is a short film that dives into the mind of an abused spouse in an unbearable situation, exploring themes of marital abuse and mental health, as the producers themselves say. A splendid example for why the horror of the mundane can only effectively emerge rather recently, by the way, since this is a topic that was best kept behind closed doors for the longest time. The premise of a short film is very simple. Marcy, the spouse, seeks refuge from her abusive husband through knitting. But he isn't willing to grant her this and keeps demanding sandwiches to still his seemingly endless hunger. At first, Marcy is willing to give in, but as she's getting more infuriated with her husband, she adds her own secret ingredients, starting with soap. Her husband doesn't mind, obviously, so she goes a step further, by adding something… well, see for yourself.
Marcy! What part of sandwich do you not understand? Can't you do one damn thing right?
At last, as her husband keeps yelling at her, she drops a glass of mayonnaise, and the last secret ingredient… well, I guess you know where this is going.
I won't make it myself, you idiot!
Obviously, the sandwich is the subject in question that meaning has been ascribed to. For one, it symbolizes the control her husband has over Marcy, and thus marital abuse as well as marital suppression, insofar that Marcy must play a housewife while her husband remains comfortably seated in front of the TV. It serves as an allegory for a highly toxic relationship with patriarchal tendencies. On the other hand, as Marcy is adding more and more secret ingredients, the sandwich also serves as an allegory for Marcy's liberation and emancipation. After all, a sandwich is very much a blank canvas. 2 slices of bread, then proceed to add whatever the hell you want. By taking that liberty, Marcy utilizes the sandwich as a mean of rebellion, very much turning the tables and reclaiming the symbol of suppression her husband has established. It's a two-sided coin. Well, so we think at least. Until…
Marcy! Get in here!
What is it, dear? Another sandwich? I'll wait.
Big plot twist, I know. It has been foreshadowed though. Whenever Marcy enters the room, you can already see the rotten corpse of her husband. It's just out of focus. But him being long dead isn't the actual plot twist. The actual twist lies in the misconception of a sandwich, for its entire meaning now changes. What we first considered to be an institution of rebellion and assertion of Marcy's independence now is quite the opposite. The sandwich now symbolizes the cycle of abuse Marcy is still stuck in, and seemingly can't escape from. The sandwich is a trigger to Marcy that lets her relive the abuse she has survived, and how she felt whenever she made him one of these. And in that sense, the sandwich marks the liminal threshold between reality and imagination for Marcy, enabling these two to be in a constant flux with one another. The sandwich is an opening through which reality and imagination overlap, thus blending into something old, yet new. The past and the now, so to speak. A very personal issue that most of us can still get behind to a certain degree, I'm sure. And a fantastic yet very sad example for how much horror can actually be behind something as mundane as 2 slices of bread. Thank you so much for watching. If you've liked this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more, a subscription would be greatly appreciated as well. If you'd be interested in some further reading for whatever reason, The Yellow Wallpaper, a short story by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, is another fantastic example of the horror of the mundane, and funnily enough, it was published in 1892. Ticks all the boxes though. Either way, I hope to see you in the next one, and yeah, until then.